free.
She vanished when the spotlight was brightest. Judith Durham, the ethereal voice behind the Seekers, was once the sound of a nation rising. She was Australia's first true sweetheart, a woman whose voice soared across oceans and touched millions. But at the very height of her fame, when she was worshipped around the world, she made a decision that stunned fans and baffled critics. She walked away. No scandals, no public breakdown, no media frenzy, just silence. And behind that silence, a lifetime of heartbreak, grief, and quiet disappearance that almost erased her from public memory. Judith didn't fade by accident. She faded by choice and by pain. The world never knew the depth of that pain. A brutal car crash that left her and her husband fighting for their lives. A terminal illness that slowly took him while she watched helplessly. The loss of love so complete, she never remarried. The rejection of commercial success in favor of artistic solitude. And a voice that once defined an era, slowly falling silent while the industry moved on. She lived through adoration and abandonment, through applause and aching loneliness, and she never begged to be remembered. Before her death in 2022, Judith Durham had become a ghost in her own legend. Revered but forgotten, present but distant. And the question still lingers. Why did the woman who gave Australia its first global musical triumph choose to disappear when the world still wanted more? What was she running from or toward? This is not the story of a star. It is the quiet, devastating unraveling of a soul who once belonged to everyone and then vanished without asking permission. In the early 1960s, Australia was still searching for its voice on the global stage. The cultural dominance of the UK and the United States left little room for Australian talent to break through. And then came Judith Durham. Born in 1943 in Essendon, Victoria, her real name was Judith Mavis Cock. From a young age, music was a refuge. Her family nurtured her talent, especially after the trauma of childhood illness left her emotionally withdrawn. By her late teens, she had begun performing jazz and folk in Melbourne clubs, her voice a haunting blend of clarity, strength, and sadness. It was that very voice that would later lift the Seekers into the stratosphere of international music. The Seekers were unlike anything Australia had exported before. Formed in 1962, they were clean-cut, melodic, and harmonically rich, a counterbalance to the raucous rock and roll explosion sweeping the world. Judith's presence transformed them. She was elegant, poised, and completely magnetic. By 1965, the Seekers had become the first Australian pop group to achieve major chart success in both the UK and the US. Their hit, I'll Never Find Another You, topped the UK charts. The Carnival Is Over became an anthem of its time. With her at the center, they outsold the Beatles in several territories, and their 1967 performance at Melbourne's Sydney Myer Music Bowl drew a crowd of over 200,000, still one of the largest concerts in Australian history. Judith was not merely a frontwoman. She was a national symbol. The press dubbed her Australia's singing angel. Her modesty, grace, and pristine image made her a figure of both admiration and protection. But beneath the composed surface, Judith was wrestling with doubts the world could not see. Fame, to her, was an unstable, overwhelming machine. She loved the music, but not the spotlight. She feared the distortion of identity that came with being idolized. As her fame soared, so did her discomfort with the commercial machine behind it. By 1968, only 6 years after the formation of the Seekers, Judith made a decision that would leave an entire country stunned. She was leaving the band. No scandal, no breakdown, no betrayal, just a calm but irreversible withdrawal. The announcement felt like betrayal to many fans. In the age of Beatlemania and fan hysteria, such a choice was unfathomable. People demanded a reason, but Judith offered none beyond a need for personal and creative freedom. In reality, the pressures of relentless touring, the erosion of privacy, and the growing disconnection between her artistic soul and the polished product she had become had taken a toll. She was exhausted, spiritually and emotionally. She launched a solo career, leaning into jazz and classical influences, genres far less commercially viable, but more aligned with her true voice. The critics were polite, but the audiences weren't there. She had abandoned mainstream fame at a time when female performers had little space to reinvent themselves outside of it. And yet, Judith never tried to claw her way back into the spotlight. She moved to the UK, married musician Ron Edgeworth in 1969, and quietly built a life far removed from the adoration that had once consumed her. Still, her image loomed large in Australia. Nostalgia kept her name alive, even if the industry had long since turned its gaze elsewhere. The Seekers reformed occasionally, and Judith would rejoin them for special events, but always with a kind of emotional distance. Her performances were precise, beautiful, and haunting, but her eyes rarely held the same light. In interviews, she was respectful of her past, but never nostalgic. She seemed to view her time in the spotlight as something borrowed, not earned, as if it had happened to someone else entirely. What Judith left behind, intentionally or not, was a mystery wrapped in music. Why did she walk away? What did she lose in the process? And what quiet battles did she continue to fight in the decades that followed? As we step further into her story, we begin to see not just a career, but a soul that chose peace over praise, isolation over applause, and paid a quiet, painful price for it. Judith's early solo years were not marked by triumph, but by reinvention. While the world still associated her with chart-topping folk pop anthems, Judith herself was reaching for something deeper, quieter, and more personal. She released jazz albums, recorded classical works, and sang in small venues that contrasted sharply with the stadiums she once filled. In 1971, she released Climb Every Mountain, a work that was more meditative than commercial. It wasn't made to dominate the airwaves, it was made for herself. But the world wasn't listening. The same country that had once hailed her as a national treasure now offered polite indifference. Her audience had moved on, and Judith, stubbornly independent, refused to chase them. Her marriage to Ron Edgeworth became her anchor. He was a jazz pianist, soft-spoken, loyal. Together they toured modestly, preferring art over acclaim. They lived simply, often on the outskirts of the spotlight, where Judith felt most at ease. But the shadow of the Seekers never fully faded. The public still adored her, even as the media left her behind. And every few years, that old nostalgia would pull her back. Reunions, tribute performances, and anniversary specials. Yet each return only deepened the divide between who she had been and who she had become. Then came the accident. In 1990, while traveling with Ron and Victoria, they were involved in a serious car crash. Judith suffered injuries that left her physically shaken and psychologically unmoored. But it was the months that followed that truly broke her. Ron was diagnosed with ALS, amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, a degenerative and fatal disease. From that moment, Judith's world collapsed inward. The man who had shared her second life, the one person who had understood her retreat from fame, was dying. She stopped performing. She withdrew from public appearances. She became a caretaker, and it consumed her completely. Ron's illness progressed quickly. ALS is merciless, stripping away movement, voice, and breath. Judith, who once soared on stages across continents, now spent her days in quiet agony, watching the love of her life deteriorate. He died in 1994. Judith never remarried. She never even hinted at romance again. In interviews, she spoke of Ron with reverence, as though their love had been her only real chapter. After his death, she wore black almost exclusively. She gave away many of her possessions. Her grief became her companion. Her later musical projects were more personal than ever. She began writing about loss, longing, and spiritual searching. Her 1996 album, Mona Lisa's, was an introspective tribute to the quiet, overlooked moments in life. But the industry no longer had a place for her. Fame had moved on, and Judith was too proud to beg for relevance. Instead, she devoted herself to causes close to her heart: charity work, disability advocacy, music education. She lent her name to noble efforts, but never sought the spotlight they might have given her. The early 2000s brought a gentle resurgence. The Seekers were inducted into the ARIA Hall of Fame. A documentary aired about her life, rekindling interest in her story. Judith performed again, cautiously. She sang at the 2000 Paralympics, her voice still strong, but tinged with something more fragile. Her later concerts felt more like farewells than comebacks. Audiences noticed her growing frailty, the way she moved slowly, cautiously. She was not the Judith of the 1960s, nor did she pretend to be. She was a survivor of fame, of love lost, of a life lived in silence. In her final years, Judith suffered from bronchiectasis, a chronic lung condition that quietly drained her strength. She rarely spoke of it. Her final performances were seated. Her last public appearances were brief, often behind a piano, her hands folded neatly in her lap. And then, in August 2022, the voice that had once enchanted millions fell silent forever. The public mourning was respectful, but subdued. A few headlines, a few tributes. And then, quiet. Judith Durham, once Australia's most beloved voice, was gone. And with her, an entire era slipped further into memory. She had once belonged to everyone, but in the end, she chose to belong to no one. And the world, busy with new stars and louder stories, barely noticed the absence. The fall had not been sudden. It had been slow, deliberate, and quietly devastating, just like Judith herself. There is something almost cruel in how fame remembers people. Judith Durham was not forgotten, but she was softened, sanitized, smoothed over by nostalgia. The sweet girl with the angelic voice, the quiet icon of the 60s. But what they forgot, what they refused to look at, was the haunting cost of that sweetness. Judith didn't retreat from the spotlight because she couldn't handle the pressure. She retreated because she saw what it did to the soul, and she chose, with terrifying clarity, to save herself, even if it meant being left behind. Behind the shimmering success of the Seekers was a woman who never felt like she belonged in the machine of fame. She once admitted, "I always felt like a guest in that world." The constant travel, the performances, the interviews. It wasn't a dream. It was a performance within a performance. Even at the height of her popularity, Judith was battling panic attacks and anxiety that left her sleepless and hollow. Her voice, so effortlessly pure, was often pushed through emotional exhaustion. No one saw it. No one asked. Everyone just wanted her to keep singing. After Ron's death, friends say Judith changed permanently. She became more spiritual, more withdrawn, but also more fiercely private. She declined interviews. She ignored industry events. She stopped responding to many professional requests. Behind the curtains of charity appearances and tribute shows, she was barely holding together. She would break down in private, sometimes in the middle of rehearsals, quietly excuse herself, and return minutes later, composed but dimmed. What most fans never knew was how much Judith struggled with the idea of legacy. She felt the world only remembered her for what she had already left behind. In personal letters, she confided to friends her fear of becoming a statue, celebrated but frozen in time, lifeless. The music industry often tried to bring her back for one more tour, one more recording, but Judith saw these offers not as honors, but as intrusions. "I gave them everything I had," she said once, "and I'm not sure they noticed when I stopped." Public reaction to her death was polite. Politicians called her a treasure. Artists praised her influence. But there were no global vigils, no sweeping tributes. A few radio stations played the Seekers for a weekend, and then the airwaves moved on. What lingered were the messages from fans who still remembered her face, her voice, and most hauntingly, her absence. A voice like hers doesn't simply fade. But Judith Durham had made sure her silence spoke louder than any standing ovation. The truth was, Judith didn't fall. She descended, slowly, purposefully, into a life of near invisibility. And that choice, radical in a world obsessed with attention, left many confused and others uncomfortable. Was she bitter? Was she grieving? Was she simply free? No one knows, because she never told them. And that, perhaps, is the most unsettling truth of all. Judith Durham had secrets she never intended to share, and she took them, every one, to the grave. At Aussie Uncovered, we don't just celebrate fame. We examine what it demands, what it erodes, and what it ultimately leaves behind. Judith Durham's life is not simply the story of a gifted singer. It is the quiet chronicle of a woman who chose peace over applause and solitude over spectacle, even when the world still longed to hear her voice. Her decision to walk away from fame wasn't weakness. It was one of the most defiant, if self-aware acts in the history of Australian entertainment. We see in Judith a figure who refused to be owned by her image. She resisted the machinery of celebrity, the expectations of endless reinvention, and the pressure to remain palatable, perfect, and profitable. Instead, she clung to her integrity with a kind of aching nobility. And for that, she paid dearly. While others built empires on visibility, Judith's legacy is quieter, but perhaps deeper. Her music was never just about popularity, it was about purity. And that purity, in an industry that rewards spectacle, eventually isolated her. Some may argue that she should have stayed, should have capitalized on her name, her history, her legend. But we see something more valuable in her withdrawal. Judith Durham didn't chase relevance, she transcended it. She gave the world her gift. And then, when she had nothing more she wanted to give, she stepped back. And that silence was not failure. It was choice. A rare, sacred kind of choice in a world that never stops demanding more. What do you think of Judith's decision to leave it all behind? Was it a retreat or a triumph? Did she disappear? Or did she, in fact, protect herself from a system that too often consumes the very people it claims to adore? How should we remember someone who refused to be remembered the way we wanted? Let us know how you remember Judith Durham. Did her voice shape your childhood? Did her music give you comfort? Or are you just now learning about the weight she carried behind that haunting smile? At Aussie Uncovered, we believe that every story matters, even the ones told in silence. Especially those, because in Judith's silence there was a defiance louder than any encore. And in her absence, perhaps, a lesson for all of us about what it really means to live, to give, and to walk away. She once sang, "The carnival is over." And for Judith Durham, that line was never just a lyric. It was a quiet prophecy. The crowds faded, the lights dimmed, and the world moved on. But she didn't mourn it. She embraced the ending like someone who had seen the truth behind the curtain and chose not to return. Hers was a legacy shaped not by longevity in the public eye, but by the dignity of knowing when to let go. What remains now is not just the memory of her voice, but the silence she left behind. A silence that speaks volumes. It tells us that some lives, no matter how bright, are not meant to be consumed endlessly, that some stars are not falling, they're stepping back into the darkness on their own terms. And maybe, just maybe, that's where their light shines the most. Judith Durham didn't want to be an icon. She wanted to be whole. And in her quiet, aching way, she was. She lived a life filled with music, yes, but also with heartbreak, spiritual longing, and deep, deliberate solitude. She gave everything to the stage and then everything to love. And when both faded, she gave what remained to herself. Some stories were never meant to be known, but now you know. Now we remember her not as a pop sensation or a nostalgic footnote, but as a woman who had the courage to disappear before the world was finished with her. That is a different kind of bravery, one not often applauded, but deeply human. Judith Durham's voice may have fallen silent, but her choice echoes still in every artist who steps away, in every soul who chooses truth over legacy, and in every quiet moment when the music fades and the carnival is truly over.